this. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with this quote. And it happens to be from our very own professor, Melanie Holbert, who says, sociology is not just a perspective of society and groups. Instead, it's an active science, an activity that examines the phenomena of the social world. A couple things about this quote. Sociology isn't just in our head. We just don't talk about what we think and have some perspective and go, oh, like all this whole group of people is like this. It's actually active in the sense that we have to go find the data for our perspective. This group of people's like this. How are you going to prove that? What are you going to do to get away from your subjective knowledge or your opinion and move into objective knowledge or facts? When we look at society as sociologists, we really need to come with objectivity. Our opinions and our point of view is great, but it literally has nothing to do with the rest of the world. Being able to open our minds to all the aspects, remember that sociological imagination, opening our minds to every aspect of that possible situation, that possible group, that possible, societal issue. If we can really look at all the facts, then we can get a true picture of what society is. So let's talk about crime for just a minute. Is it more dangerous to live in cities or more dangerous to live in the suburbs? Is there more crime in the cities or more crime in the suburbs? Are there more deaths in the cities or in the suburbs? We're going to automatically say cities, right? But that's our opinion. We're from the city. We know, we hear, we see the news. We pay attention to what's around us. We know where the violence is. However, we got to look at the data. And what we find out, Lucy, and I don't know this person's first name. When you list data, you list it by their last name and the year. So what we have in our notes here is Lucy, 2003. They found that a person living in a semi-rural suburb were more likely to be killed by a stranger than a person in a city. So think about that for a second. What she's saying is that if you live in the suburbs, or even if you're in a sub-rural area, between, let's say, Inglewood and Douglas County and Jefferson County, Jefferson County could be almost semi-rural, right? And Montbello and Green Valley Ranch, they get all the way out there, right? So in any of these areas, is there more violence in the suburbs or in the city? Lucy looked at a couple of key factors to analyze the data. They looked at not only homicide data, like the killing of strangers that most people think about, but also traffic fatalities, which also almost involve strangers, right? In fact, car accidents are caused more than twice as many deaths as do homicides. So where do people have a tendency to get into car accidents? Where they drive at higher speeds in more narrow roads, like neighborhoods, right? They actually, some data somewhere said that you are more likely to get into an accident within a 4-block radius of your house than on the highway. And so if you think about this idea where people are driving quickly, but they're doing it on narrow roads, they're doing it around corners, like you might find in semi-rural suburbs, then there is more likely chance of them being hit by a car and dying from a stranger. Secondly, the researchers collected data on the relationship of murder victims to their killers. It turns out that only 1 in 6 murders is committed by a stranger. Most murders are committed by family members, acquaintances, or coworkers. So if we're looking at crime and violence, and Lucy wanted to look specifically at where it's more dangerous to live by determining where you could be killed by a stranger, it already starts to turn out that the suburb is the most dangerous place to live, right? You're more likely to get into a car accident. And if you are murdered, it's not going to be by a stranger. It'll likely be by a family member. Again, where might your family member kill you? In your home. Where do most people live? In the suburbs. Where do they work? In the city. This is basically the central idea around collecting data and doing sociological research, right? We can assume all kinds of things we want to assume about the cities, but when we start to look at the data, it comes out that maybe our assumption or our opinion isn't correct. And we got to stick with that objective knowledge and facts. The scientific method has 6 steps. So right off the bat, you got to determine if there's a problem. You got to find out if there's an issue. In the scientific method, you got to ask the question. Next, you need to review past literature or research any existing sources. What's the background and others? What is the background and what do other studies say about the problem already? Next, your hypothesis. What will you study? You're going to formulate your real question, like what is specifically are you going to look at with this social issue or social problem? Next step, design a project. And again, design and conduct a study are both over here as one, but we're going to start here with design a project. Now, there are different types of research method, and you're going to see that in the next slide. There's several different kinds of research methods and projects and things that you can do to study a specific topic. Once you do that, then you need to collect the data, do the research, go out and perform that study or that project. Then once you've got all your data and you're sure you've got a good sample set means chunk of data, you're going to analyze that data. What does that research tell you? Does it support your hypothesis or does it negate it or go against it? Next, you're going to state your findings and conclusions, and that usually is published. This is when we start to see journal articles being written by sociologists in journals like Sociology Today. All right, here's your next slide. Different types of research methods and project designs. Now look, that first slide on the types of research methods, that specifically is on the test, but there's a lot of other stuff that you're going to need to know. Know that there are a ton of different types of methods and project designs and things that you can do to test hypotheses. Let's just go through them. Surveys. Obviously, you give a bunch of surveys to a bunch of people and collect that data. Like, so it can be very simple. It can be, the trick to this one is you want to make sure you have a good sample set. So if I am trying to test out the emotional state of teenagers on a Friday, I need to test teenagers on Friday, right? I need to give a survey to teenagers on a Friday or about Fridays. But do I want to give it to old people? Do I want to give a 67-year-old person a survey about how they feel on Fridays at school? No. You need to make sure that the data collection set that you are collecting from is the right one. And with that said, it also needs to be big enough. Let's say I want to go ahead and test this Friday theory with teenagers. Would I only give surveys to kids at WEC? Or would I have to give them to teenagers all over the United States? Would that give me a better data set? Next, we have experiment. There are several different kinds. There are several kinds of interviews. One is structured, so you have a specific amount of questions as well as this designated types of answers. I'll give you an example of this. I got a phone call regarding some of my political affiliation and ideas. And, there was 10 questions, but each question had the same 4 answers. It was like, strongly agree, sort of agree, don't agree. So one of the questions was, do you think Donald Trump is doing a good job as president? Strongly agree, don't agree, strongly disagree. I know which answer I'm going to pick on those, right? Because I'm getting the same 4 answers for every single question. That's structured. Unstructured is more open-ended. So what do you think about this? How do you feel about this? The answers, the questions are very open-ended, and the answers might lead to other questions, right? So there isn't necessarily a definitive amount of questions or a definitive answer. Next, we have semi-structured. It's kind of the same. So I give you 3 choices, but then of those choices, I ask you why you picked the one you picked. So there's a specific answer and then a non-specific answer. Next, let's look at observations. Now, when we get into ethics, not ethnics, ethics and ethical research, we're going to talk more about observations because there is some disagreement. We need to have consent from our subjects, but how could we then observe them in their natural setting without interacting with them and without skewing our data. So the idea behind observations is it's overtly covert. So you are trying specifically to not let the person who's being, or the group who's being observed, know you're there. Next, we have case studies. Case studies are usually over one person in a group that we're trying to study the effects of, drugs in New Jersey by evaluating this one person. It can be short-term or long-term, and often case studies come with other data and other research. So what has already been studied about drugs in New Jersey, or what has already been studied about this specific person that could come back to my hypothesis. Next are ethnographs or ethnographies. Ethnographies. This is basically the sociological go-to, I feel like, because it is either large group or culture over long time. If you can remember back to Nakarima, that was kind of an ethnography, right? It's studying a culture over a long period of time to learn how they do things. Next, we've got longitudinal, which is basically the same thing, only it's the same people or person. So it's either a small group of people or it is the same person over a very long time. And this is like, I want to study the effects of high fructose corn syrup and diet over, a 10-year period. What does it really do? And so I might take one or two subjects and, here we go with this this idea of who's going to be in my study, right? I might take one person and never give them high fructose corn syrup, and take another person and always give them high fructose corn syrup, and then evaluate those two different things. So that's longitudinal. All right, moving on. Data, data, data. What do we do? What are we collecting? What type of data are you actually collecting? Quantitative and qualitative are two very specific kinds of data. Quantitative means quantity. So this would be getting a whole bunch of data and then looking at it. I want to study teenagers in the United States, so I want as much data from as many teenagers in the United States. Qualitative has to do with quality. Maybe I want to look specifically at something very narrow and something very specific. So I wouldn't do a whole large group. I would do something very small. I would want to make sure that the quality of my data is better than the quantity, right? It's more important than the quantity. There is secondary data, which is somebody else's data. You might see this when we look at a literature review. Next kind of data is primary data. This is your own data and research. Now we have ethical issues. When we are looking at our data and our studies, what could possibly go wrong? What is going to make our research skewed? And what do we need to make sure that the research is pure, that our data is legitimate? Neutrality. You really don't want to interact with your subjects and change the outcome. The question comes in, can you really be objective? Or are you always going to have some bias? Or are you always going to shift the data in some way? Or can you truly stay neutral? Can you truly just look at the data or not interact in such a way that changes your subject's answers or performance? This is a tough one. Sociologists argue about this all the time. This is where a lot of research goes wrong. I was up there telling you guys at the beginning of the blue test, white test, math test, that blue makes you smarter. I already set you up. Even if it wasn't true, the students taking the blue test, I'll guarantee you would have done better, even if the tests were identical, just because I told them that blue made them smarter. So you don't want to skew your data by interacting too much with your subjects. Next is this idea of informed consent. You don't want to do experiments on people if they don't know you're doing it, right? You don't want to be messing with people's lives without their consent. However, how then are you going to do an observation of a group of people or a person in a certain setting without them giving consent? This is this idea of overtly convert, overtly covert. In other words, you're trying to make sure that you really, really, really don't interact. And so these two can be really tough to kind of go together. By the way, these are things that could go wrong. They're not necessarily things that do go wrong. If I do observations and I don't get informed consent, it doesn't necessarily throw my data out, right? It's just something that could go wrong. Let's say if somebody sees me watching them. Maybe I'm at a park and I'm watching a bunch of kids, and maybe I'm a man and I'm taking notes and I'm taking pictures. This is not informed consent, and somebody may find out that I'm doing that. My data will be skewed as soon as a mom comes over and tells me to get out of here. This is this idea that I need to be really, really covert. I really need to be hidden. You want to keep their anonymity. I'm never going to go printing a report that says specifically this person told me this. In many case studies, they will use a different name of the person that they are doing the study on. It should be confidential, and that's kind of in the same idea that there is anonymity, right? There's going to be no way that they're going to find out who in the study was saying what. And then again, this kind of comes down to this idea so anonymity, anonymous, and confidential, these two things kind of come together. Voluntary participation and informed consent also kind of go together. Do your participants know that they're doing it, and have they agreed to do it willingly? Again, you don't want to coerce somebody to be a part of an experiment and then, do it without them knowing what's happening or without their consent. And that falls right into our the almost last one, is do no harm. When you are doing a sociological research project, you don't want to do any harm. I don't want to study a group of people by killing half of them and seeing how the other half react, right? And I only want to assess relevant components. I want to assess the things that are actually going to make my data set correct. Make sure, again, to turn in your discussion questions and go ahead and get started with week 3. More exciting stuff to come. Hugs.